dug around the, there's stuff on top of the rock.
Yeah, we found a really large crystal there. Coleman, right?
Yeah, Coleman, that's just where we went. Coleman. I guess they still dig for minerals there, for crystals. Basketball in college? Are you happy with the results? Yeah. It's going to be a little bit taller inside, isn't it?
All right. Is that loud enough? Yeah. Good. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Hope your Sunday morning is off to a good start. All that good kind of stuff. We're going to be mainly in John chapter 18 this week. You'll remember last week we were going through 17. We're going through Jesus' prayer. We got through almost all of it. There's like 3 verses of chapter 17 that we didn't get to. We'll just hit that very, very briefly. And then we will go ahead and get into chapter 18. So, we left off in verse 24 of chapter 17. And so, Jesus has been praying. He prayed for himself first. He prayed for his disciples. And this was the third section where he's praying for all believers. So, we kind of made the point, basically praying for us. And so, he's gone through a lot of it. And this was the last part that we didn't cover here. So, real quickly. Father, I want those you have given me to be with me where I am and to see my glory, the glory you have given me because you loved me before the creation of the world. Righteous Father, though the world does not know you, I know you, and they know that you have sent me. I have made you known to them and will continue to make you known in order that the love you have for me may be in them and that I myself may be in them. And so we see in verse 24, Jesus prays that we would see Jesus' glory, that we would be with him, for all believers to be with him in glory. So essentially making the point, he wants us to be with him. And it's interesting, it's, you kind of get the way it's written, the way he kind of says it, you kind of get the anticipation of it's like, I can't wait for them to see this. I can't wait for us to be together. I can't wait for us to all be together here and for them to see what this is like. And so paints us a little bit of a picture there. Some of the wording here, again, we saw this a little bit earlier in some of the different parts of the prayer where it kind of gives us a glimpse into the eternal nature of the Trinity. And we see a little bit of that in the wording here as well. Before the world was formed, the Godhead existed in perfect unity. He also prays a little bit broader. He prays that the church would also see his glory. And then in verse 26, he prays that the love that God has for the Son would be in all believers and that he would be in them. It's kind of interesting. I was reading that again this morning. It's like simple words, but when you think about really what he's saying, that the love that God has for Jesus, the love that God has for his Son, he prayed that that would be the same kind of love that we would all have. And you think about that, that's a pretty tall order. That's a pretty high standard, but you kind of get the idea of how he's envisioning this, what we should be striving for, what he's looking for. And so that's kind of how he closes out his prayer. And so we'll jump into chapter 18 now, and we'll kind of see where they go next. Let's look at the first 3 verses here. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. So from a timing standpoint, they've been in the upper room. They finished the meal. Jesus has been talking to the disciples. He's just finished up his prayer that we read about in chapter 17. And so now they're getting ready to leave. So they leave the upper room and they're starting on their way to the Garden of Gethsemane. And if we think about what we know through history and through the architecture and stuff like that, they would have left by the gate. They would have gone down a steep valley and they would have crossed the channel of what they called the brook Kidron. One of the things that's interesting about this is the brook Kidron is where the drainage from the temple went. So if you think about it, the altar that's in the temple had a channel, and that channel ran down to this brook that they're crossing over. And so if we know timing-wise, we're in the Passover time frame. And so all the blood of those Passover lambs that were killed during this time has drained out through that channel in the altar and is drained into this brook that they're crossing over. And you think about that and you say, how many Passover lambs was that? What's the number of that? And it was immense. There was history shows that probably about 30 years after Jesus' time on earth, they actually did a census to kind of count how many lambs were sacrificed. Anybody even have a crazy idea? According to what I was reading, they said that the census number came back that they sacrificed 256,000 Passover lambs on that one year when they counted. So think about that. There, whether that was the number or not, or we know there was a lot. There was a lot of sacrifices going on during that time frame. The several days going up there, that was the only way that logistically they're even going to be able to get all these lambs sacrificed. And so they do that. So now think about Jesus and his disciples, and they're crossing over this brook where all this stuff, all the blood from the Passover lambs is kind of passing through into that brook. So if you think about that, what do you think the brook looks like when they're crossing over it?
It'd be pretty ugly.
Wouldn't be a pretty sight. So you think about all that blood in there. So odds are probably pretty good that it had a pretty strong red tint, or it looked like it was red, or something like that. It was very obvious. And it's kind of interesting when you think about some of the symbolism here. If you're, I don't know if the disciples necessarily get it at this point. Maybe reflecting back later in life, it struck them. But if you're Jesus, you know what you're walking toward. You know what's going to happen in the garden. You know you're going to get arrested. This is all leading up towards the crucifixion. And you're crossing over and you look down and you see all the Passover blood's lamb mixed in the brook there, passing as you go across. And so it's a very visual reminder that, this is what I'm walking toward. This is what's next. So once they cross the brook, they come to the Mount of Olives, and on the slope of this mountain is where we're going to find the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, in this account in John doesn't call it the Garden of Gethsemane, and it's kind of interesting. There'll be a few different places today where we'll talk about some things we know from the other gospel accounts that John doesn't necessarily use in his account. As we see reading the different gospels and how they look at this, they all kind of emphasize different things, and John has some things that he seems to be more focused on than some of the other accounts. But we know from, Matthew and Mark let us know that this was the Garden of Gethsemane, so that's how we know where they were going. If we look at that word, the word Gethsemane means oil press, where oil was extracted from the olives that grew on that particular hill. So we get a little bit of an idea of what's going on. Many well-to-do people, many of the wealthy people had their private gardens there in that particular area on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. Jerusalem, the way it was constructed, there really wasn't space for private gardens. There were also some ceremonial prohibitions that wouldn't allow the use of manure on the soil of Jerusalem. So that's why the wealthy people had their private gardens outside the city in this area on the Mount of Olives. Luke's account says that during this Passover week, Jesus, and we're going to assume his disciples, spent the nights on the Mount of Olives. The language that's there, and we won't get too technical, but the language that's used in Luke probably indicates that Jesus had been in the habit of using the garden as maybe a place to meet a lot, maybe where he slept a lot of nights during the time of his ministry. And John, even in his account here, references the fact that they met there often. So this is a very familiar place to them. What's interesting to think about is, since most of these were private gardens that people owned, it's more than likely that whoever owned this particular garden, the Garden of Gethsemane, maybe gave them a key to the gate. Maybe they had some kind of arrangement. There's some understanding that this was okay for them to do. We don't know. We're speculating, but it's interesting to kind of think through that piece. It was a familiar place. So if you think about Jesus and what's getting ready to happen, it's very obvious Jesus isn't trying to hide. Jesus isn't trying to get away in a place where no one will know where he is. He knows what Judas is going to do, and he knows that Judas is going to think this is more than likely where Jesus and the rest of the disciples are going to be, because this is where we went all the time. This is what we do. So Jesus hasn't changed his pattern there. Jesus knows exactly how this is going to play out. And again, the point being, there's time frames here, and we'll talk about it again in a minute, but if he wanted to get away, he didn't have to go there. There's a lot of different places he could go. If he wanted to not be so, quote unquote, easy to find, there's a lot of different places he could have gone and stayed during that time. But that's not what he did. He went to where he always goes, and he knows Judas would know that he was there. It's interesting. There is a large show of force that comes in here to arrest Jesus. And I don't know that just reading it that necessarily stands out, but we look about what we know about some of the way this is described. It says there was a detachment. So there's a detachment of soldiers. And that means there's a large number of Roman soldiers. And we know from history how the Romans kind of classify some of their military divisions and what some of the numbers are. There's probably 2 or 3 different meanings in terms of what this detachment could be in terms of numbers. But if it matches what they normally did, this could be anywhere from 200 to 1,000 soldiers. So you think about that. They're coming out to arrest Jesus. And, I guess a lot of times when I've read it in the past, I'm thinking, 3, 4, 5 soldiers. This is a detachment. They're bringing the troops. There's a lot of people coming out there. It talks about officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. This is probably more than likely the security force that's associated with the temple. So you've got the Jewish contingents, that's the security force from the temple. You've got the Roman contingent, that's this detachment. In Matthew, he talked about how this group came, not only came in numbers, but said they came with swords and with clubs. And so not only are there large numbers of people, they're armed. They're ready for a conflict. They're ready for some kind of a fight. And this is a huge show of force for what seems like a fairly simple arrest. It talks about lanterns and torches. You'd say, well, why did they need that? Well, you're kind of trying to reconcile a couple different things. It's nighttime. They've had the meal, so it's dark. But it's interesting because historians think that given kind of the time, the month, etc., this was probably a full moon in this time frame. So there's probably a lot of moonlight. It's not exactly pitch black. There'd be some natural light from there. But more than likely, they're bringing the torches and the lanterns because they're prepared to search. If Jesus is on the run, if Jesus is hiding somewhere, they're going to need those to kind of look in some of the darker areas, maybe look in some caves, look in different places. So not only have they brought weapons, they've brought a source of lights in case they have to search for Jesus. Why such a big show of force? Why did they think this was necessary? And did the religious leaders, the Romans, expect, or were they afraid that there's going to be some kind of battle or some kind of conflict, and they needed the big show of force to kind of put it down quickly, or to maybe discourage them from even starting a fight? Was that maybe the logic? It also kind of shows that Judas is kind of the contact here. He's the liaison that set this all up, and he's betrayed Jesus, and he's leading them to Jesus. It's just probably another example, too, that he didn't really have a good understanding of the nature of Jesus or his power if he didn't want to be arrested. And not just Judas. We talk so many times about the disciples where they don't understand at that point a lot of what's going on, or they look at it in a very limited way. But if Judas understood the nature of Jesus and understood why he was here, he realized there wouldn't have been a resistance. Or on the other hand, if he realized Jesus as the Son of God, if Jesus didn't want to be arrested, you could have brought thousands and thousands of troops. It wasn't going to make a difference. That wasn't good, If Jesus didn't want to be arrested, he certainly had the Father at his beck and call. He had the ability to put down any attempt to arrest him if that's what his goal was. So, again, Judas not really understanding what's going on. So this is everything, and this is kind of the crowd and all these people that are coming up here, coming to the garden to arrest Jesus. Let's move on to verse 4. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you're looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." So we've been saying this, or I guess I've been saying it, kind of all along, is Jesus knew what was going to happen. If Judas thought that he was sneaking up on Jesus, if Judas thought this was some kind of, he's going to catch Jesus by surprise, then he was wrong. Jesus knew all this. And again, we talked about Jesus put himself in a position where he could be easily found. Judas didn't surprise Jesus with this. Jesus knew what was happening. If you think about his surrender, it was very conscious. He knew it was going to happen. He went to the garden fully knowing that Judas had gone to the chief priest and agreed to betray him. He knew that Judas was going to come here to the garden to look for him. That'd be the first place that he would look. There's a part of this too where you see the courage of Jesus in this, that when they arrived at the garden for him, he's not hiding. In fact, he's the one that steps out. He steps out and meets them, and he starts the conversation. "Who is it you want?" And so here he is, a single unarmed figure stepping out in front of this large contingent of soldiers and temple security and all of that. He hits it head on. He doesn't hide. He doesn't avoid it. He steps right out and starts this. This part is real interesting to me too. They drew back and fell to the ground. And this is interesting, trying to understand. You're mentally starting to get a picture of the size of their force and stuff, and yet he steps out, he speaks, they pull back, and they fall to the ground. You're saying, wow, here he is, that, single person, he's not armed, he's not initiating any conflict or anything. But there's an aspect of this where the authority of Jesus makes itself is known. And they can see he's not frightened. They can see the courage of Jesus. Maybe it frightened them. Maybe this is not what they were expecting. They're a little bit taken aback. Did his presence, did his power, did his authority radiate so strongly that the captors were caught off guard? Did they expect to find someone fleeing and afraid, but found themselves in the presence of a commanding figure? There's something about just the presence of Jesus sometimes that I don't know that we fully appreciate. You think about just how he handles situations, how he diffuses situations, how he's so wise in the answers and the discussions and the things that he says. It's one of those things that we can read it. I almost think we would, it's probably not a smart thing to say. I think we would appreciate it a lot more if we could have seen this and just kind of see this and get the sense of just what Jesus' presence was like and the influence that had on people that were around him. But one thing that's very apparent here is that Jesus is in complete control of this situation. If this were a typical earthly situation, authorities chasing a fugitive kind of thing, we wouldn't think of the fugitive being in control. But the tables are kind of turned here. Jesus is in complete control here. He knows what's going on. He's, it's at his doing. He knows what's going to happen. He's not showing fear. He's hitting all this head on. He knows what has to happen. He knows what this is leading to. So they fall down. He's answered the question. He asks the question again, who is it you want? And it's interesting because by doing this, he's kind of brought their attention back to him. There's probably a lot of different things that could be distracting. They're probably looking around. They may be seeing the disciples. What's happening over here? Who is this guy? And he kind of brings it back to center again. Who is it you want? He kind of brings it back to him. They give the same answer. They again say Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus again says the same thing. He says, I told you that I am he. One of the things that's interesting here in the language is the translators translated this as I am he, but really the original language is I am. So by saying I am, this is Jesus' way of saying that he is God, and he's connecting his words here to all the many other places in the Gospel of John where we might call it the I am statements. I am this. So there's a connection there. I think the translators probably added the he, maybe to help us understand a little bit. But if we go back to the original language, his answer is not I am he, his answer is I am. His surrender is voluntary. If we remember back to chapter 10, Jesus had said that no one takes his life from him, but that he lays it down of his own accord. So again, it comes back to the concept of he's in complete control here. The only reason they're going to take his life, the only reason they're able to arrest him, the only reason they're able to take him is because he's allowing it to happen. We go back, I was mentioning this a few minutes ago. There was plenty of time to have left Jerusalem. If he did not want to be captured after the meal, he had plenty of time to leave and get to some place away from Jerusalem where the Jewish leaders couldn't find him. But he didn't hesitate. Instead, he goes to where he knows he's going to be found, and he's the one who walks out to meet them. And then there's also the aspect here, I don't know if we notice this all the time, but he's protecting the disciples. He's prayed for the disciples a little bit earlier in 17, and he went through the whole section we talked about. He knows what's ahead for these men. He knows the mission. He knows what they need to accomplish. And when he's praying in 17, he's prayed some very specific things for them. He's prayed for the Father to protect them, to sanctify them. He protects the disciples where he says, then let these men go. I'm the one you want. I'm the one you're looking for. So take me and let them go. And so even in that moment of getting ready to be arrested and everything that's getting ready to happen, he's thinking of other people. He's thinking of his disciples, his friends, all of these things over himself. So just another example of Jesus and sacrificial love happening here. Verse 10. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. So here the actual arrest happens. Peter pulls out a sword, and this is interesting because we don't hear about the disciples and having swords a whole lot. We know they're fishermen. We hear a lot about fishing and different stories like that. Now, if we go to Luke's account of this story, evidently, as they're getting ready to go, one of them remarks, we have 2 swords here, and Jesus says that's plenty. So there seems to be at least 2 swords that they have with them at this time. So apparently, it's maybe not unusual. We don't think of this, but maybe it's not unusual for the disciples to carry swords, or maybe at least 1 or 2 with them. That probably makes sense in that, they lived in a time of robbers, violent men, and maybe it's just a form of protection for them. We don't read about them getting into sword fights or having conflicts, but perhaps it was just one of those things that we don't think about, that it's a deterrent. It's a deterrent, and it's one of those things you did in the day. There's some observations here about how John approaches this, maybe versus the other Gospels. John's the only Gospel writer to identify Peter as the one who draws the sword and cuts off Malchus's ear. The other accounts just mentioned it was one of the disciples that did this, but John actually names Peter, which is in maybe that's not knowing Peter a little bit, that we've come to know him at this point through the Gospels and stuff. Maybe that's not a foreign thought to us that would be Peter. If we were asked to guess, I'm sure a lot of us that'd be one of our guesses. That was probably Peter that did it. And Matthew tells us that Peter had previously said that even if he had to die with Jesus, he would not deny him. So Peter already seems to be of the mindset that if this comes down to war or battle, I'm there with you. I'm going to fight with you. John is also the only Gospel writer to mention the high priest's servant's name was Malchus. And so there's some speculation. How did John know this? Is there some connection? Did John have connections to the household of the high priest? And we'll read here in a little bit, it says he was known to the high priest. If we think about, sometimes as we read the Gospels, if we read the book of Acts, where certain people are actually named, specifically named, a lot of times it's because they were known among the early Christian community. We don't necessarily know who they are, but the people that the letters were written to, who were going to be reading the Gospels, who are going to be reading the Acts of the Apostles, they would be familiar with some of those names. And so some have kind of speculated, does that mean at some point down the road people knew Malchus because maybe he became a Christian at some point? That's where commentators and everybody just speculates and all that stuff. Who knows? But it is interesting that John is the only Gospel writer that actually names Malchus. Peter cuts off Malchus's right ear. And usually the question we ask there is, well, what was he aiming for? Again, they're fishermen. They're not skilled swordsmen. They're not soldiers necessarily. So we don't necessarily expect their skill to be great. But we probably doubt that was his intention. I'm just going to cut off one of his ears here. So a lot of people think, speculate, he was probably trying to hit him right smack dab in the middle of the head and missed and caught an ear. Is probably what he did. It's interesting. I don't want to call it a conspiracy theory, but it's interesting to kind of read some different things where people have speculated and said, if Peter were right-handed and he were facing this person, it'd be hard to cut off their right ear. Make more sense to say, cut off the left ear. And so then some people say, well, was the guy facing him or was he turned the other way? Yeah.
It depends on which way Malchus ducked.
That's true. Yeah, we probably need CSI Jerusalem to straighten that one out there. They can do a reenactment and tell us what happened.
Reattach it miraculously.
Yeah.
So this guy left with a way different perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. But and isn't it interesting that Jesus has reattached the ear, and there's not really a lot. You just wonder, because it's like, well, that's not something that happens every day. It's like, do the people even around them even realize what had just happened, that his ear had cut off and that Jesus had healed it and everything? And, if you're this guy that just it's like, what, filling your ear? It's like, wait, whoa, this is a little too weird for me. I think I'm done here. I'm leaving, kind of thing. You just wonder those things that we don't know sometimes what happened.
You said he was trying to do his forehead, or maybe trying to cut his head off.
That's his. There is no telling.
I don't know how sharp a sword was.
Yeah. Odds are it's a pretty wild swing, and he just kind of was just hoping to hit something.
Is that the only? Simon Peter, is he? I guess he might be the only one we hear that had a sword, but probably a lot of them may have had. But he's impetuous and stuff,
right?
And young, and
yeah.
Boom.
Yep. No, definitely. I mean, we know that some of the other accounts tell us that they had at least 2 swords with them. So somebody else had a sword as well. It is curious to think. We don't normally think about those things. It's ironic that Peter in this moment is willing to draw his sword and to do battle with what could be hundreds of people, hundreds of captors. He's willing to engage in battle. He whips the sword out. He's swinging at people. And yet soon he's going to deny Jesus 3 times. So it's just kind of one of those highs and lows of Peter, or just, maybe life and situations sometimes. One moment he is on fire and he's ready to take on who knows how many hundreds of Roman soldiers and everybody, and we're going to stand our ground and battle this out. And then shortly thereafter, he's going to end up even denying that he is one of Jesus' disciples. So Jesus obviously has a different idea. Tells Peter, put your sword away. Says, Peter, this is the cup the Father's given me, and I'm willing to drink it. If the Father's permitting this to happen, if this is part of how this is going to roll out, then I'm glad to endure that. This is my path. This is what I'm going to do. You see Jesus again demonstrating love in these areas. He spares, by getting the attention away from the disciples, he spares them potentially being arrested, those types of things. He demonstrates love for his enemies. He heals Malchus's ear, even though that wasn't recorded by John. We know that from other versions. So the Roman commander, the officers, the Jews, they arrest Jesus. By now, sounds like most of the disciples have scattered and deserted. Jesus has kind of given them the little window, say, let these guys go, and they go. Although we'll see shortly that a couple of them hang around to follow. It is interesting, again, note that they bound Jesus here. So Jesus has willingly come out to them. Any physical resistance that was getting ready to happen, he's already put that down. Yet they think he's dangerous enough that they need to send a large number of soldiers, and they bound him as if he's some kind of threat. And we'll see throughout this whole time that he continues to remain bound during this. Jesus is taken first to Annas. John's the only gospel that tells us Jesus went to Annas first. There's a biblical scholar, Edersheim, that says Annas was generally hated and viewed as detestable or evil, that he was the power behind the throne in Jerusalem. He had previously been the high priest. Some of his sons had also served as high priest, and the current high priest, Caiaphas, was his son-in-law. Under the Roman occupation, under Roman rule, the office of the high priest had become corrupt, and Annas had gained wealth through essentially extorting the worshipers. If you think of like Jesus clearing the temple because of the money changers and all that, those are the ways that Annas was getting money, becoming wealthy off of those situations. And the Jews themselves hated Annas and his household. He was not loved among the Jews. There's a collection of writings we call the Talmud. It kind of covers Jewish law and tradition. It's from somewhere between the 3rd and 6th centuries, but it's got a passage that reads, "Woe to the house of Annas, woe to their serpent's hiss. They are high priests, their sons are keepers of the treasury, their sons-in-law are guardians of the temple, and their servants beat the people with staves." So even through Jewish history, Jewish lore, there's no love lost for Annas, and this is who they brought Jesus to. Let's keep moving here. That's 15. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple who was known to the high priest came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" she asked Peter. He replied, "I am not." It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter was also standing with them, warming himself. So we do know that Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. We heard the scattering thing, but evidently they decided they would watch and follow. It doesn't say it was John. Tradition has it that the other disciple was John. It kind of fits in a couple different ways. What's the connection? How does John have these connections with the high priest? He's able to kind of talk to the servant girl, get Peter into the courtyard and that stuff. We do know from other places, obviously, John was a fisherman. We know that his family seemed to be successful fishermen, so maybe there was a business. Maybe they supplied the fish or something to the high priest. Who knows? But somehow they know John. We don't know how, but somehow they know him. Well, they go they're in the courtyard kind of waiting. They're not with Jesus, but Peter initially gets stopped at the gate, and John's able to go, if this is John, John's able to go in, and then he comes back and talks to the woman, the servant girl at the gate, and says something to her, and then she lets Peter come in as well. So, in this one, but again, not necessarily with Jesus where he's being questioned, but inside where the people are gathered around the fire and things. It's interesting in her question where she asked him, "Are you a disciple too?" And there's some speculation. And again, I'm just going to kind of default to John with the caveat that it doesn't say it's John, but that's who we generally think it is. Is it one of those things where she knows John's a disciple, they know each other somehow, and she's asking Peter in that vein, but Peter keeps denying it. Yet John, or whoever the other disciple is, doesn't seem to deny it, if that's the connection. The other thing that's interesting here is they stood around the fire, probably trying to blend in while keeping warm. It's interesting, John uses the word stood. Luke and Matthew say sitting. Sometimes the way they use words and they use language in that time is not as literal as we take it sometimes. John may have been just trying to convey the idea that they're stationary, they're continuing to be there, that's where they are. So he says standing, the other accounts say sitting. It may not be as literal as we're taking the standing. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter to us one way or the other whether he's standing or sitting. On to 19. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. "I have spoken openly to the world," Jesus replied. "I always taught in the synagogue or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So we're kind of shifting back and forth. We've seen Peter in the first denial. We're back to Jesus before Annas. There's some interesting things in this exchange that we may not pick up, but it was an essential regulation of Jewish law that a prisoner must be asked no question that answering would admit any kind of guilt. So the way Annas is questioning Jesus, he's actually violating Jewish law, or the principles of Jewish justice when he questioned Jesus. And so Jesus, in kind of a subtle way, is reminding him this when he essentially says, don't ask me questions, ask those who heard me. You should be asking the witnesses first. You shouldn't be asking me. That's how this is supposed to work. And so the thought is, take your evidence about me in the proper and legal way, examine your witnesses, which you have every right to do, but stop examining me, which you have no right to do. So we kind of see kind of the fallacy of the trial and the questioning and how this doesn't even follow the Jewish custom here of how this is normally happens. One of the officials slaps Jesus in the face and is effectively saying, are you trying to teach the high priest how to conduct this trial? You shouldn't be saying those things. And Jesus' reply is effectively saying, if I've said or taught anything illegal, the witnesses should be called. I've only stated the law. Why are you hitting me for that? And so this is an interesting thing, and at that point, Annas decides to send Jesus to Caiaphas. Note, he's still bound as he gets sent. 25. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself, so they asked him, you aren't one of his disciples too, are you? He denied it, saying, I am not. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. Didn't I see you with him in the garden? Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment a rooster began to crow. Again, if we look at some of the other gospel accounts, there's more detail about, Peter cursing, calling curses down on himself, Jesus looking at Peter, some of those different things. John doesn't focus on that. He's trying to mix in. When they said Jesus looked at Peter in the Luke account, it does give some indication that somehow Peter was able to see Jesus. I don't know that it was close, but somehow he's able to see something. I don't know what he can see. Did he see Jesus getting slapped? Can he hear any of the questions or anything? Who knows? But there does seem to be some indication that he could see each other. John references the third challenge coming from one of the high priest's servants who was a relative of Malchus. Again, it's one of those things. How does John know that? No. Maybe it was just, divine, the Spirit giving this knowledge to these people as they put the gospel together. But again, it kind of hints towards a connection that John somehow knows a little bit about the inner workings of the high priest house, knows some of the people, some of the comings and goings, because he seems to know who these people are. Peter denies Jesus for the third time, and the rooster begins to crow. Let's move to 28. I'm sorry, I'm moving a little bit faster, trying to get a little bit deeper here before we cut off. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanliness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, what charges are you bringing against this man? If he were not a criminal, they replied, we would not have handed him over to you. Pilate said, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. But we have no right to execute anyone, they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. So again, from the other gospel accounts, we know that when Jesus was sent to Caiaphas initially, it was for a trial of two parts. There was a hastily gathered assembly of the council that we read about in Matthew 26, and then the official daylight meeting of the Sanhedrin, as we read about in Luke 22. John only mentions that Jesus was sent to Caiaphas. He doesn't go into any of that kind of detail, and that Caiaphas sent Jesus to Pilate. So John is a lot more focused on Jesus before Pilate versus these other parts. They went to the palace. In some translations, that might be the Auditorium. This was the headquarters of Pilate in Jerusalem, where Pilate held court, where he conducted his public business. So they're going to see Pilate. An example of hypocrisy here, that the Jews wouldn't go into the palace to avoid being defiled. Again, they refused to break what's a relatively small command regarding ceremonial defilement, but they broke much greater commands in rejecting God's Messiah and then condemning an innocent man to death. So we see this. Jesus even talks about it sometimes about strain a gnat, swallow a camel. So this is not the first time we've seen that kind of hypocrisy. From secular history, Pilate appears to be a cruel, ruthless man, corrupt, insulting. He murdered people who never had a trial, who were never condemned. He comes out, and the first thing he says is, what charges are you bringing against this man? and this is normal. This is part of the normal legal routine. In this regard, he's almost like somewhat of a judge. So he's saying, well, before we start anything, what's the charge? What are we considering here? So formal charges had to be made before he can move forward in the case. The Jews aren't really kind of looking for it to be that way. Pilate's expecting to judge a matter and hear everything and make a judgment, and the Jews just all they want Pilate to do is just execute a death sentence. Kind of like, trust us, we've already kind of put him through our stuff. He's guilty. We don't need you to do that part. We just need you to kind of condemn him to death because we can't do that. That's what we need from you. So there's a little bit of this back and forth going on here. They had his cooperation in making arrests. Now they apparently want Pilate to take their word for it that the man the Romans had helped to arrest was dangerous and needed to be executed. Pilate again is resisting. It's like, why am I doing this? Why does Rome need to be involved in this? Take care of them yourself. We don't see it in John. We know from the other accounts that the religious leaders eventually give some more detail about what their charge is. They talk about things about he's perverted the nation, he's forbidding people to pay taxes to Caesar, he's saying that he himself was a king, which is interesting because in the Jewish side of things, they're accusing him of blasphemy. But they're not going to go to Pilate and say, well, his crime is blasphemy, because Pilate's not going to care. That's not going to register with him. So they're going to try to say things that are going to be a little bit more inflammatory. Oh, he's trying to be a king. He's trying to do these things. He's saying people shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar. That's more likely to get Pilate's attention. And so that's kind of their tact there. Rome had taken away the power of the Sanhedrin to inflict capital punishment. So that's kind of their thing at this point. If the Jews had done it, they would have killed him by stoning. That's how if the Jews had the ability to do capital punishment, they would have stoned the person. But again, we see all the little workings here, all the pieces coming together that are leading towards crucifixion, and all the little pieces that came together. We are coming up right against the end. I'm just going to give you a few quick things here. I think next week, and whoever's teaching, I don't know who's teaching next week, but when you get into 19, Pilate will continue the questioning. You'll see some more about he sends Jesus to be flogged and some of those things. So they're kind of at the back and forth. He gets Jesus in. He's saying, are you the king of the Jews? And then Jesus is asking him, are you asking me? Is that your question? Or is that what the other people want you to ask me? And so, Pilate's probably looking at this more about, is this guy a threat? Is he a threat to the Roman Empire? And Jesus says, well, I am a king, but not a king in that sense. I'm not a political threat to you. I'm not a physical threat to you. My kingdom's not of this world. And so they have the dialogue back and forth. He kind of they're talking a little bit about truth. Pilate says, what is truth? And then seems to cut off the dialogue. It's like he's done at that point. He doesn't want anything more to do with it. So the dialogue is shutting down, and that's kind of where this is. I'm going to call that kind of the ending place. Where he is with Pilate. We're not done with Pilate. We'll see more of that next week in chapter 19 as this continues to play out. But that's kind of where we are so far. So I'm a minute over. I apologize for that, but thank you for your attention. And I guess next week on to chapter 19.
Yep,
Bryant Perry. So ask all your Pilate questions to Bryant Perry. There you go.